homely. So I'd also like to thank Holly, because actually that was really kind of rich, and I hope that what I have to say articulates and kind of meshes with it. So for my contribution to the theoretical setting the scene for the colloquium, I'd like to make connections between the concepts that are the terms of reference, the epistemic justice, narrative capability, and participatory research. I'd like to make it as an argument. I'm not sure it kind of works like that. I'm not even sure it's a narrative, but perhaps it is. But it includes proposing that narrative capability is a necessary but insufficient condition for epistemic justice. And I want to keep in mind as I'm talking what Emily Henderson will remind us, I think, later on, that concepts are only stories. That is, they're one way of looking at things. So, of course, I'll expect to be argued with about them over the next 2 days. So in terms of the structure of the talk, I'm going to start with the capability of epistemic contribution. It's not a term used in the title of the colloquium, and it means the capability of being a teller and listener in society. I'm then going to discuss how epistemic justice is served by narrative capability, and how narrative capability is supported by participatory research, expanding the freedoms of marginalized groups to narrate their own lives. And I'm going to illustrate the points that I make with reference to a common story that students in our Mirato project brought together in a project known as the Photo Voice, which Carmen and Mikatika are going to talk about later on. They led the project. So I'm going to end with a tentative discussion about how making epistemic justice might be further expanded by combining what I've called in this presentation narrative and discursive knowledge. So I'm starting with the capability of epistemic contribution, and it's advanced by the philosopher Miranda Fricker. She proposes that this capability should be promoted as a core human capability. I think most of you here are familiar with the capability approach. And the idea of a core or universal or foundational human capability is taken from Martha Nussbaum, whose interpretation of the capability approach encompasses human rights. So from Fricker's point of view, the epistemic contribution should be a core human capability, means that everyone has the right to opportunities and means and freedoms to be confident givers of knowledge and attentive, open-minded receivers of knowledge in society. And she argues that it is core because communicating, that is talking and listening, is universal. All human beings are driven to communicate with each other. So in human development terms, well-being and fellowshipping has an epistemic dimension. That is, we're diminished if we are prevented from or not given opportunities for sharing authentic knowledge and information in a climate of mutual respect and trust. She compares the give and take of knowledge, the epistemic give and take, if you like, with the give and take of hospitality, which is social. So the first step for me is to establish that everyone has the right to make epistemic contributions in society. So the next thing is to consider the meaning of epistemic justice in relation to this right to make epistemic contributions. So to start, not with epistemic justice, but with epistemic injustice. So people living in poverty or of low status in society, or people who are oppressed or persecuted, are very often silent and silenced in society. And this is epistemic injustice. And so in Fricker's work, the emphasis is less on making epistemic justice, rather more on guarding against epistemic injustices. And this is because her philosophical method is called failure first. So from her point of view, the virtues, the systemic virtues of justice and equality are only ever sustained under endemic counter pressures. You can't rely on them staying there. So constant vigilance and efforts are needed to fend off injustices and inequalities. And I think it's quite important to keep that in mind. We can never take for granted that epistemic justice is achieved, if you like, or any kind of justice probably. So in Fricke's view, success states, and by success states she means institutions or systems or other circumstances where you can see justice operating, she thinks that they are states of resistance against the erosion of justice. And I'm going to use this term success state again later in the presentation. So similarly, she thinks of individual virtues as dispositions against vices such as selfishness or anger or envy and that kind of thing. And again, so understanding the nature of the injustices and inequalities, and I think this might be one of the answers to Melanie's questions, that narrative can help us understand the nature of these injustices. So understanding is critical to knowing how to create success states. And the metaphor that Fricke uses, medical. The ideal social organism will have a well-functioning immune system. You cannot design one of those without a proper understanding of its susceptibility to disease. So how is epistemic contribution frustrated? From Fricke's point of view, there's two ways that this can happen. And one is by way of testimonial injustice. That is, when a speaker is not seen as credible because of prejudice about who they are, as a credible teller, a speaker, because of who they are. And secondly, by way of hermeneutical justice, when a speaker lacks the means to be intelligible to others. And these injustices are strongly indicative of wider structures of unequal distributions of resources and services and unequal distributions of status and power. So just as there are socio-economic injustices, there are epistemic injustices when people aren't given credence as sources of testimony or are denied the capabilities to give those testimonies. And historic exclusions from education everywhere indicate that epistemic injustice does play a large role in the establishment and the extending of socio-economic injustices. So I'd say epistemic justice, it can't be separated from other social and economic injustices. They are intrinsically related, so that efforts to overturn injustices should always take account of the epistemic, and often it is neglected. So there are lots of ways of thinking about staving off, if you like, epistemic injustices. And here, my argument is that creating opportunities and freedoms or capabilities for marginalized groups or oppressed groups to tell interested interlocutors about their lives fends off epistemic injustice. And this is both because these kinds of opportunities enhance epistemic self-confidence and because the knowledge created is authentic and interesting and of political use. So in other words, these opportunities challenge both testimonial and hermeneutical injustices. So the capability of epistemic contribution, giving knowledge in society and receiving it, can't be achieved unless epistemic injustices are staved off. So next I want to talk about how narrative capability puts individuals and groups in a position to rebut social injustice. Michael Watts defines narrative capability as the real opportunities individuals have to tell their stories. And for Watts, the real opportunity includes what he calls narrative capital. So that's the capacity to tell a good story, which is a hermeneutical issue. Have people got the means to tell a good story? And so he argues that narrative capability is of fundamental importance to the capability approach because it enables recognition of what makes human lives worth living. I want to digress a little bit now to go back to Fricker to talk about her definition of capability of epistemic contribution. In her work, she envisages the exchanges between small groups whose epistemic purposes are all tied up with each other, so families and friends and colleagues. And because everyone has an innate capacity to talk and listen to people and is socialized to share information and social understandings, the issue is not so much narrative capital or the capacity to talk, but it's rather social uptake. So from her point of view, that is that arrangements, social arrangements, should be such that epistemic inputs are not rejected, as she puts it, or underrated. So for her, the primary locus of obligations are the social arrangements, and the necessarily educational level for individuals to make contributions is, in her words, basic. So despite making a distinction between epistemic materials, she thinks of informational and interpretational, she's not really much interested in what knowledge for what purposes forms the basis of epistemic contributions. So here, I'm departing from Fricker a bit to make the case that narrative knowledge is an epistemic contribution whereby social justices can be powerfully challenged by those who experience them. So, just to talk about narratives a little bit, I'm sure I'm not as good at Holly at this, but I just want to kind of simplify it slightly to make a point later. So narratives are, I think, a special kind of knowledge which can be exchanged and distributed. So narrative, it's for the sake of my argument, narrative knowledge is centrally concerned with knowing what it's like or how it is. And to frame, as I say, what I have to say later, I want to distinguish narrative knowledge from discursive knowledge, which is more focused on why it is and how it is, making explanations. So, of course, narratives can include both. But I want to introduce the distinction here to establish for the time being that I'm thinking about narratives as producing knowledge about what it is to live lives of various forms of unfair deprivations. So again, returning to Fricker, narrative capability can be thought in both testimonial and hermeneutic terms. So testimonial justice demands places and spaces and fora and audiences for storytelling. And hermeneutical justice demands supporting narrative capital, being able to tell a good story well, knowing when and where to say it and to whom. So I would think of narrative capability as what is called a combined capability. So it's an internal capability on the one hand, defined as an internal state of having learned how to tell a story. But for the whole capability to be achieved, there needs to be the social take-up. That is, the stories need to be attended to, respected, and recognized as important. Now, I think participatory research, and now we can come on to the third term, satisfies the arrangements for narrative capability because it offers both fora and audiences and a form and an educative element which can shore up narrative capital. So, in the terms of the Colloquium, it can, in this way, make epistemic justice. So to move on to participatory research. So I think we can see participatory research as qualitative researchers interested in the narratives of marginalized or oppressed groups, shifting from using their own narrative imagination, and I'm using Nussbaum's term here, Martha Nussbaum, who uses the term narrative imagination to put yourself into somebody else's shoes. So normally, this kind of research would make efforts to understand participants' stories from the perspective of the participants, to retell the stories as respectfully, accurately, and authentically as possible, to show interest and concern and respect. And these are ethical imperatives for the researcher. But nevertheless, the participants remain subjects of research, however loud I think some of the claims to co-construction of data are. So in participatory research, the subjects become co-researchers and producers of knowledge. So I'm discussing here, as I said, participatory research, which focuses specifically on how it is and what it's like for co-researchers who are members of marginalized groups. This might be controversial, but everyone has stories about all kinds of experience and events, and many are of interest. But for the purposes of making epistemic justice, I think some stories are more salient than others. These are the stories of those for whom Michael Watts describes as disempowered by a hegemonic discourse. So this, as I say, this empowerment can take many forms: oppression or persecution, the unjust experiences of pain or cruelty or fear, historical exclusions and deprivations. So for epistemic justice, these stories should be told by those who have experienced them and listened to by those who've not. The philosopher Nathaniel Adam Tobias Coleman makes the point lucidly when he refers to epistemic justice as it manifests itself in academic writing about slavery. And this is what he says: "We should treat the arguments of authors once enslaved as Negro with moral deference. Thus, our reflection on epistemic injustices relating to Negro slavery leads us to a new methodology for social and political philosophy. In an ideal social world, and were we pursuing ideal social theory, we ought to approach all accounts from all authors with moral neutrality. However, since we live in an unjust social world, and since we are pursuing a social theory fit for that particular unjust society, our generalized moral indifference must give way, on the one hand, to a moral distrust of accounts offered by the socially dominant, and on the other, a moral deference towards accounts offered by the socially oppressed. Applied to my book, Why Was Negro Slavery Wrong?, this methodology involves my approaching the canonical accounts of British, French, and Prussian theorists of slavery with moral distrust, and my approaching the accounts of formerly enslaved authors and Haitian revolutions with moral deference." So it's a challenge to epistemic injustice to take a stance of moral deference towards narrative knowledge imparted in stories told by those who are affected by the systemic inequalities. So it's generally possible to obtain statistical profile of such inequalities, but understanding the lived reality is more elusive, but just as important for discussion and action about what to do to fend off injustices. Now, not all participatory research is with or about marginalized groups, but in terms of epistemic justice, its potential lies in the space and support for previously unheard groups to express their own realities and meanings and to have them taken seriously or listened to with moral deference. This kind of participatory research can be both a vehicle for narrative capability and produce narrative knowledge which reveals and challenges epistemic injustices. I'll just say something now about the educative or pedagogic element of participatory research, which is often included, and I think which needs to be considered. So as well as providing some guidance on storytelling and forms of representation, the task can be how to convince co-researchers that their stories are valuable when their experiences have been otherwise. Akili Mbebe calls for pedagogies of presence, which in the context of South African higher education, he says, black students and staff have to invent a set of creative practices that make it impossible for official structures to ignore them and not recognize them, to pretend that they're not there, to pretend that they do not see them, or to pretend that their voice doesn't count. Conditions are needed that will allow black staff and students to say of the university, "This is my home. I'm not an outsider. I don't have to beg to be here. I belong here." So I think participatory research can be constructed as this sort of creative practice. And in Fricke's terms, it can create sites of resistance, what she calls success states, where epistemic justice is staved off by fostering narrative capital and offering social take-up of significant stories, which in turn amounts to epistemic contribution on the part of the co-researchers. So now you're going to have a nice break, because I'm going to illustrate some of these ideas about epistemic justice and narrative capability and participatory research with the participatory element of our Mirato project, which I think many of you are familiar with. It's a 4-year multi-method project with the main research question: how do young people from low-income households educated in rural and township school access, participate and succeed in higher education and then move on to work? The participatory element, known as the Photo Voice project, was comparatively small, and as I say, it was led by Mika, Tico and Carmen, who will tell you a lot about it in more detail. So briefly, the focus was the experience of going to and being at universities, and the stories were produced were visual, photographs with captions, and then turned into books. And as co-researchers, students attended workshops to learn about producing life stories. They received some basic photography training. They created individual life stories, and finally in March this year they agreed on images representing a common story about coming to and being at university. So what I'm going to show you now is this common story in 12 pictures. Each has a title, and I'll read out the captions in English, which in the books are also translated into the 5 African languages that the students speak. Okay, so this is what it's called, The Bitter Truth of Success. The unknown, and the caption is: the excitement of going to university, then journeying to a completely familiar place. We do not know what to expect. What will the university be like? What will learning be like? What will it mean to be a university student? Money. Lack of money hinders everything. It stops us from pursuing dreams of a bright future. Live or leave. Financial challenges makes us feel we're being shut out. All doors are locked to us. Worries and compromise. Lack of money means lack of choice, and we must opt for poor and cramped living conditions, sharing with 2, 3, 4 other students, cooking in a small room just to have a roof over our heads. We do not always have enough to eat or money for transport. Obstacles in our university path, so our process of learning is hindered. Academic failure. Education is our key to a successful life. It's broken. We're unable to cope with financial challenges and balance our workload. The struggle is real. Depression follows isolation, money worries, poor academic performance, and thinking negatively. Then, adaptation. The quicker the better. Being introspective and overcoming the differences and being able to fit in as a university student. The bowl of fruit. Any student can take a piece of fruit. It makes a difference to have the care, support of lecturers and a good relationship with them. Sometimes lecturers, but not all or even many, do get involved and help all students succeed academically. Friendship. Teamwork and friends working together lead to good results, delivering goals so we can settle and progress effectively in this unfamiliar environment. Thriving through difficulty. Though we face ongoing obstacles, we manage to grow regardless of the environment that is not favourable to students like us. There's always an adjustment. Light at the end. Our determination and hard work, the support of others, and our family's hopes will bring us into light from darkness. You can see these are wonderful photographs. They've really learned how to tell a story in pictures. So I'd like to make a few observations about this story in relation to making epistemic justice. The first is that these students were more than capable, I think, Carmen and Mika, of telling their own stories. From the start, I think they possess narrative capital, narrating vividly and engagingly and confidently their own experiences of university. I think the workshops were a crucial educative element, passing on skills and building confidence. And the participatory research itself offered the fora, the materials and the audiences, but they were already storytellers. Secondly, they made use of their narrative capability in pursuing a valued life. And here's what some of them said during a discussion in March about what they'd gained from the Photo Voice project. I'm not alone. We share challenges and aspirations. We're from the same family. We're part of something. This is encouraging. It's motivating. You see how far you've come. The chance to express ourselves, to tell our stories, and now the whole world will hear. It's very, very important to speak out, to be vocal. It frees you. Owning my truth, but not letting my problems define me. So, in Paul Ricoeur's terms, telling their own stories has opened up possibilities for the students for being different in the world. So the narrative and epistemic capital, that is what they know and understand about their own lives, has been mobilized to generate stories, and this does link with possible futures, to imagine better possible futures, which is very important to these students. And as can be heard, the narratives created an epistemic community which stimulated them. So the third observation I have is that we academics involved in different ways and extents in the Photo Voice project were given, if you like, epistemic material. So like all good stories, these stories bestowed the gift of a deeper understanding of human experience and how socially constructed hierarchies of power and discrimination affect everyday lives. The stories helped us, in C. Wright Mill's famous phrase, to connect personal troubles with public issues. They can also be provocative. Polakov describes the relationship between engaged social researcher and participants like this, or co-researchers. In every story there exists a dialectic between teller and listener, and at some moment the horizons of telling and listening fuse. Engagement begets reciprocity and participation in the world of the other. So I think the space of the participatory research in Mirata can be seen as a success rate in Fricke's terms. It featured self and collective expression by which students became creators of knowledge. They became audible and visible, and narrative opportunities and freedoms were expanded. I'm now coming to my tentative part, so it's very much up for discussion and grabs. So it's the fourth observation which leads me on to this thought about the limits on epistemic justice made by narrative capability by way of participatory research. And this is my fourth observation. So as you saw and heard from this common story, the university environment and culture is conveyed, if at all, as rather unfamiliar and excluding. It's the students who must do all the work of, as they call it, adaptation. So instead of consistently good teaching and attentive lecturers and an inclusive culture, what's going to see them through to their bright future and the light is their friendships and their family, their high aspirations, their own robustness and resilience and determination. So from this and from a corpus of interviews that we have, we get little sense that the students recognize how their personal struggles are shaped by unfair structures and systems, or that their circumstances are structured by colonialism and apartheid. So I think as social researchers, we take these stories of subjective experience, which is central to how constraints and enablements play out in lives, maintaining the status quo or changing. We combine the subjective meanings of living in a specific concept with our concepts, as Emily will discuss, I think, later, and our knowledge about the concept, if you like, our discursive knowledge, to interpret the stories further in exploring how and why. To make explanations. And this brings me to what Mikatiko and Carmen name in their abstract as the decolonizing potential of participatory research, locating it in histories of struggle about what knowledge becomes legitimate and what is excluded. We know that elites have long asserted power to produce specialist discursive knowledge. Yet all the time, knowledge in all fields is shifting and provisional. Previous knowledge is delegitimized. New knowledges open up thinking about innovation and alternatives to the status quo. And these new knowledges, in turn, are often domesticated and colonized again by elites. For me here, Michael Young's distinction between knowledge of the powerful and powerful knowledge is helpful. So the Morato students' narratives don't hold the university's policies and practice to account or challenge the structures of power and discrimination. So my question is whether discursive knowledge might combine with narrative knowledge to allow them to interpret their lives and make powerful challenges. Could epistemic justice be pushed further by engaging students with critical concepts and histories of struggle? I am eager to discuss these questions, which I'm not equipped to answer because I'm aware that I'm probably unaware of my own knowledge biases. And Bebe argues that in South African universities, a Eurocentric canon regards other epistemic traditions that don't rest on division between reason and nature and don't strive for universality. It's a hegemonic, the Eurocentric canon is hegemonic, so it's very difficult to think out of its terms of reference. And in his book, Epistemology of the South, de Souza Santos has some very uncomfortable ideas. He says, in our time, genuine radicalism seems no longer possible in the global north. Those who proclaim themselves as radical thinkers are either fooling themselves or fooling someone else, since their practices are bound to contradict their theories. Most of them work in institutions such as universities that require protective hats and gloves to deal with reality. One of the tricks that Western modernity plays on intellectuals is to allow them only to produce revolutionary ideas in reactionary institutions. Despite this, I still want to ask that whether for the capable of epistemic contribution, the Morato students need the kind of powerful knowledge which gives them high ground on their lives, society and work, which supports their sense of place in history and an ongoing transformation in society. And of course, lives can't flourish, nor society and democracy, if on the one hand graduates are ventriloquizing alien knowledge, or on the other educated to believe that all knowledge is equally powerful. So might truly powerful knowledge emerge from a combination of narrative and discursive knowledge, in which I think the narrative knowledge can be seen as paramount. Any criticism of alienating institutional norms, of disregard or disrespect, whatever is unjust and fair, must speak to personal everyday lives. And this is because lives are important, not concepts. Ricoeur suggests that narratives mediate between what is and what ought to be. I suppose what I'm trying to argue is it's hard to see how such mediation would work without both narrative knowledge, which enlightens what it's like, and discursive knowledge, which attempts the explanations and alternative solutions to problems. A possibility might be to strengthen the pedagogical element of participatory research. Perhaps we could bring our concepts, epistemic justice, capability, and so on, into the open and find ways of encouraging co-researchers to interrogate them. It is a pedagogical task to guard against the epistemic injustice of constructing people as uncritical consumers of concepts and theories. But boundaries operate around who does and doesn't have access to diverse, powerful knowledge that allows thinking about alternatives. So perhaps these boundaries could be explored in a spirit of non-domination, which chimes with descriptions of decolonial pedagogy. So to conclude, I've argued that in participatory research, narrative and epistemic capabilities combine when co-researchers from historically unheard groups are constructed as credible tellers of their own valuable stories, and when they're offered means to make them intelligible and compelling, as this one is. And I've shown how the Mirato project has done this. But I've also argued that while narrative capability is essential to epistemic contribution, it might not complete the work of epistemic justice, which of course is never complete, as I've said. In struggles for justice all over the world, exchanging knowledge about how and why people are living in poverty or are refugees is as necessary as exchanging knowledge about what it's like to be living in poverty or be a refugee. And should these exchanges always be carried out by different groups? One group, if you like, speaking for another. So as scholars, we're gatekeepers of all kinds of heady concepts about injustice and transformation, which our research participants and co-researchers often have not been introduced to. And perhaps we can think about the rights and wrongs of this. Thank you.
Questions one at a time?
Yeah, one at a time, please, yeah.
Right, questions. We'll also take them one at a time.